We turn now to that remarkable scientific breakthrough. 13,000 years after the last dire wolf walked the earth, scientists say they've now brought them back.
Before anyone had even figured out how to bring an extinct animal back, one species was already writing one of the most unbelievable survival stories in modern science. It wasn't the famous gray wolf. It wasn't the legendary dire wolf. It was a smaller, overlooked predator that had almost disappeared without most people ever noticing. For decades, experts believed its fate had already been sealed. The wild population had collapsed, its bloodline had nearly vanished, and by every biological rule, there was no realistic path back. Then something happened that nobody expected. Scientists announced the birth of several animals carrying the genetic legacy of a species thought to be lost forever. At first, headlines focused on the return of the prehistoric dire wolf, but hidden behind that sensational announcement was a much more important breakthrough. Those same technologies were quietly unlocking the future of one of America's most endangered predators. A species that had been trapped in a genetic dead end for nearly half a century suddenly had a second chance. And the reason that second chance existed wasn't because scientists had perfectly preserved its DNA. It was because nature had secretly protected it all along. For years, researchers believed they understood exactly what had happened to the red wolf. They thought they knew where its bloodline ended, how many pure animals remained, and why its future looked so uncertain. But buried inside ordinary-looking wild coyotes was something no one had bothered to search for. Hidden pieces of the red wolf's original genetic identity had survived in silence, passed from one generation to the next without anyone realizing they were still there. Those forgotten fragments would eventually become the key to saving an entire species. It's one of those stories that almost sounds fictional. A species declared extinct in the wild, surviving by disguising itself inside another animal. But to understand how that became possible, we have to go back to a time when losing the red wolf seemed completely unimaginable. Less than a century ago, red wolves were everywhere across the southeastern United States. They roamed forests, wetlands, swamps, and coastal plains stretching from eastern Texas all the way to the Atlantic coast. Farmers complained about them. Hunters tracked them. Wildlife officials considered them common enough that few people imagined they could ever disappear. In 1939, respected biologist Stanley Young wrote that red wolves were still widespread across eastern Texas. That same year alone, more than 800 wolves were trapped after conflicts with livestock. Numbers like that suggested a thriving population. Young even argued that these animals were simply too adaptable to ever be wiped out. They knew how to hide. They knew how to survive. In his view, extinction wasn't a realistic possibility. History would prove him tragically wrong. During the following decades, predator control programs intensified across the United States. Wolves were viewed as dangerous pests rather than valuable wildlife. Government campaigns encouraged trapping, poisoning, and shooting predators across huge stretches of their natural range. Habitat also disappeared as development expanded. Roads cut through forests. Wetlands were drained. Human settlements spread into areas that had belonged to wildlife for thousands of years. Little by little, the red wolf's world shrank. By the late 1960s, an animal that had once occupied much of the American Southeast had been pushed into a tiny strip of coastal marshland along the Texas-Louisiana border. That isolated region became the species' final refuge. Conservationists realized they were running out of time. If they waited much longer, there might be nothing left to save. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to protect the remaining wolves where they lived, biologists would capture every pure red wolf they could still find and move them into a carefully managed breeding program. It was an extraordinary plan because it meant removing the species from the wild entirely in hopes of one day returning it. On paper, the mission seemed promising. Over several years, researchers captured more than 400 wolf-like animals across Texas and Louisiana. At first glance, that sounded encouraging. Surely somewhere among those hundreds of animals would be enough true red wolves to rebuild the population. Then genetic testing revealed a devastating reality. Most of those animals weren't pure red wolves anymore. Years of interbreeding with coyotes had blurred the line between the two species. One after another, candidates were eliminated until only 17 genetically pure red wolves remained. 17. Out of more than 400 animals searched across an entire region. And the news became even worse. Only 14 of those 17 ever successfully produced offspring in captivity. That tiny group became the foundation for every living red wolf alive today. Think about the weight of that for a moment. Every single red wolf walking the earth today traces its ancestry back to just 14 individuals. For most species, genetic diversity is what allows populations to stay healthy over time. Different bloodlines reduce inherited diseases, improve fertility, strengthen immune systems, and help animals adapt to changing environments. The red wolf had almost none of that. Scientists later calculated that those 14 founders actually represented genetic diversity closer to only 8 unrelated animals. It was like trying to rebuild an entire civilization using members of one extended family. The species had escaped extinction, but it had walked straight into another crisis: a genetic bottleneck. From that point forward, every generation inherited the same limited collection of genes. Every carefully planned breeding decision became an attempt to slow the unavoidable consequences of inbreeding. For years, the work was painfully slow. Many litters failed to survive. Some wolves struggled with fertility. Others developed health problems exactly as conservation geneticists had feared. Recovery became less about increasing numbers and more about carefully managing which animals bred with one another to preserve every remaining piece of genetic diversity. It wasn't glamorous science. There were no dramatic headlines, no viral breakthroughs, just decades of patient, meticulous work carried out by people determined not to let the species disappear forever. Gradually, those efforts began producing results. The captive population grew. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily enough that, by the 1980s, researchers were ready to attempt something that had never been done before: returning captive-bred red wolves to the wild. Until then, no one had successfully reintroduced a large carnivore raised in captivity back into its natural habitat. There was no instruction manual, no previous success story to copy. Nobody knew whether wolves born behind fences would remember how to hunt, establish territories, avoid danger, or raise pups without human assistance. It was one of conservation's greatest experiments. In 1987, several red wolves were released into North Carolina's Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. Everyone watched nervously. The outcome could determine whether decades of conservation work had been worthwhile, or whether the species' future would remain confined behind zoo fences forever. At first, the signs were encouraging. The wolves adapted. They hunted wild prey. They formed breeding pairs. Soon they were raising pups entirely on their own. For the first time in years, genuine wild red wolves once again lived freely in North America. The recovery gathered momentum. Over the following decades, more wolves joined the population. By 2012, roughly 120 red wolves roamed the forests and wetlands of eastern North Carolina. Against nearly impossible odds, conservationists had achieved something extraordinary. A species once declared extinct in the wild had returned. It should have been the beginning of a remarkable comeback. Instead, it marked the start of another devastating collapse. The decline happened far faster than anyone expected. Around 2012, the wild red wolf population reached its highest point since the recovery effort began. More than 100 wolves were once again living across the marshes and pine forests of eastern North Carolina. After decades of careful breeding and years of successful releases, it finally looked as though the species had turned the corner. Then almost everything began moving in the opposite direction. Funding for recovery programs became uncertain. Political priorities shifted. Fewer captive wolves were released into the wild. Meanwhile, deaths continued to mount. Some wolves were struck by vehicles as roads expanded through their habitat. Others were illegally shot, sometimes after being mistaken for coyotes and sometimes deliberately targeted. The result was devastating. Each year, there were fewer breeding pairs. Fewer pups survived. And with every missing wolf, the population became even more fragile. Within just a few years, the numbers collapsed. By 2018, the wild population had fallen to roughly 40 animals. Then it dropped again. By 2020, experts estimated that as few as 7 red wolves remained living freely in the wild. 7. Imagine standing in an empty football stadium and realizing every wild member of an entire species could fit comfortably inside a single family photograph. It was almost impossible to believe. Even more heartbreaking was the reason conservationists had feared this exact scenario for decades. When so few red wolves remain, finding another red wolf becomes incredibly difficult. Nature doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. Animals still need mates, and when no suitable partner is available, they often breed with the closest relative they can find. For red wolves, that meant coyotes. Scientists had long considered this their greatest nightmare. Every hybrid litter seemed to push the original species one step closer to disappearing forever. Generation after generation, pure red wolf genetics appeared to dissolve into larger coyote populations. Researchers even gave this process a name: the final threat. Unlike hunting or habitat destruction, this wasn't extinction through death. It was extinction through dilution. A species simply stopped being itself. For decades, wildlife managers worked tirelessly to prevent red wolves from breeding with coyotes. They removed hybrids from breeding areas, relocated animals, and spent enormous resources trying to keep the bloodline as pure as possible. Everything about modern conservation suggested that hybridization was the enemy. What nobody realized was that hybridization had secretly been protecting the species all along. Hundreds of miles away, along the Gulf Coast of Texas, wildlife biologist Ron Wooten kept noticing something unusual. The local coyotes didn't quite look like ordinary coyotes. Many appeared larger than expected. Their legs seemed longer. Their skulls looked heavier. Even experienced hunters sometimes remarked that these animals looked strangely wolf-like. Most people ignored the differences. Wooten couldn't. In 2013, he photographed one of these unusual animals resting near an airport runway. Curious, he collected tissue samples and sent them to researchers specializing in wildlife genetics. At first, nobody expected anything extraordinary. Scientists believed the story of the red wolf had already been written. Every surviving bloodline supposedly traced back to the 14 founding animals held in captivity decades earlier. There shouldn't have been any surprises left. Then the DNA results arrived. Researchers discovered long stretches of unmistakable red wolf DNA hidden inside these Texas coyotes. Not tiny traces. Not distant evolutionary similarities. Actual red wolf genetic material. Some of the animals carried astonishingly high percentages of red wolf ancestry. The discovery shocked the scientific community because it challenged everything they thought they knew. Then came an even bigger surprise. As researchers compared this DNA with the genetics of captive red wolves, they found something that shouldn't have existed. Some of those genetic sequences matched nothing. They weren't present in any living captive red wolf. These were completely missing pieces of the species' original genetic heritage. Scientists called them ghost alleles. Think of them as genetic memories. DNA that had vanished from the official red wolf population but had quietly survived inside generations of coyotes without anyone noticing. Suddenly, decades of history looked completely different. Back in the 1970s, when the last isolated red wolves struggled to find mates, they had bred with coyotes simply because there were no other wolves left nearby. At the time, everyone assumed this was the final stage of extinction. Instead, those hybrid offspring became living genetic vaults. While the official captive population preserved one version of the species, wild coyotes unknowingly preserved another. Nature had hidden the missing pieces in plain sight. The irony was extraordinary. The very process scientists spent decades trying to prevent had also become the reason valuable red wolf genetics survived at all. Once researchers understood what they were looking for, they expanded their search. The richest discoveries appeared in remote wetlands across coastal Louisiana, particularly in areas where hunting pressure remained low. There, many coyotes carried remarkable amounts of red wolf ancestry. Some contained more than 2/3 red wolf DNA. Several appeared genetically closer to red wolves than to ordinary coyotes. For local residents, the findings weren't entirely surprising. Many had spent years insisting these animals looked different. Bigger, heavier, more wolf-like. Now genetics confirmed those observations. Hidden inside these overlooked populations was a living archive of DNA believed to have disappeared decades earlier. Finding those ghost genes was revolutionary. But discovering them was only half the story. The real challenge was figuring out whether they could actually help save the species. Around this same period, biotechnology company Colossal Biosciences attracted worldwide attention with ambitious projects involving extinct animals, including efforts connected to the prehistoric dire wolf. The headlines focused almost entirely on de-extinction. Behind the scenes, however, another project was unfolding with far more immediate conservation value. Researchers partnered with red wolf scientists to recover the lost genetic diversity hidden inside those Gulf Coast canids. Their goal wasn't to recreate history. It was to strengthen the future. Using advanced cloning techniques, scientists produced several young animals carrying exceptionally high percentages of recovered red wolf ancestry. Among them was a female later given a deeply symbolic name by the Karankawa people of Texas. Nika Kaida. It translates roughly as ghost daughter. The name couldn't have been more appropriate. She represented genetic information carried silently through generations before finally returning to the species that had almost lost it forever. Unlike traditional cloning methods that often require invasive tissue collection, researchers used newer techniques capable of growing cloned animals from specialized cells obtained through relatively simple blood samples. That breakthrough opened possibilities extending well beyond red wolves. In theory, endangered species around the world could one day preserve valuable genetics without invasive procedures. For the red wolf, however, the importance was immediate. For the first time in over 40 years, scientists had access to genetic diversity that didn't originate from those original 14 founders. Fresh DNA. New options. A chance to reduce the long-term effects of inbreeding that had haunted the recovery effort from the very beginning. Meanwhile, encouraging news arrived from North Carolina. Legal action eventually required federal wildlife agencies to resume more active recovery efforts. Captive wolves were released again. New breeding pairs formed. For the first time in years, wild pups were born successfully. Slowly, very slowly, the numbers began climbing once more. The recovery remains fragile. No responsible scientist would describe the red wolf as safe. Habitat continues to shrink. Illegal shootings still occur. And debates continue over how much conservation should rely on cutting-edge biotechnology instead of protecting landscapes where wildlife can thrive naturally. Those are important conversations. Because even the most advanced genetic technology cannot replace healthy ecosystems. A cloned wolf still needs forests. It still needs prey. It still needs space free from constant human conflict. Perhaps that's why the image many researchers remember most isn't a laboratory. It's a young wolf chasing butterflies. Nika Kaida has no idea she's become a scientific milestone. She doesn't know people around the world discuss her genetics. She isn't aware of decades of conservation history resting on discoveries connected to animals like her. She's simply doing what every young wolf has done for thousands of years. Exploring, playing, learning about the world. Maybe that's the most remarkable part of this entire story. After all the politics, the scientific breakthroughs, the court battles, the genetic discoveries, and the decades spent trying to save a disappearing species, the future may ultimately belong to animals that know nothing about any of it. They simply live. And perhaps that's exactly the outcome conservation has always been trying to achieve. Because sometimes the greatest success isn't bringing an animal back from the edge of extinction. It's reaching the point where that animal no longer needs us to tell its story. It can simply return to living its own.